The champagne was still flowing when the ballroom doors slammed open. Every conversation stopped. A woman in a black dress stood in the doorway, breathing heavily, clutching a phone in one hand and a thick black folder in the other. Hundreds of guests turned toward her at once. At the head table, millionaire Richard Whitmore stopped smiling. His bride, Elizabeth Carter, noticed immediately. "Vanessa." The woman's eyes locked onto Richard. "You told me this wedding would never happen." A murmur swept through the room. Richard pushed his chair back. "Vanessa, not here." She walked closer. "You promised me." Richard reached for her arm, but Vanessa pulled away. Then she looked directly at Elizabeth. "I'm sorry, but you deserve to know what your husband promised me before he married you." The room fell silent. Richard turned toward his bride. "Elizabeth, don't listen to her." Elizabeth didn't answer. She simply walked toward the stage. The music stopped. She reached for the microphone. Richard's face changed. "Elizabeth, please." She looked at him for several seconds. Then she said quietly, "You should be asking me to forgive you. Instead, you're asking me not to tell them what I already know." A collective gasp moved through the ballroom. Elizabeth turned toward Vanessa and smiled. "Thank you for coming." Vanessa froze, because she suddenly realized something she hadn't considered. Her invitation hadn't come from Richard. It had come from Elizabeth. And Elizabeth hadn't invited her there to destroy the wedding. She had invited her because there was something Vanessa knew that Elizabeth desperately needed. But to understand why the bride would deliberately bring her husband's mistress into her own wedding reception, you have to understand what happened 6 months earlier, when Elizabeth still believed Richard Whitmore was the safest decision she had ever made. Elizabeth Carter was 52 and had spent most of her adult life learning not to confuse wealth with character. She owned a successful interior design company in Chicago and had already survived one difficult marriage. When Richard appeared, he seemed different. At 56, he was polished, charming, and extremely successful. He owned luxury hotels across several states and seemed to know everyone worth knowing. Yet around Elizabeth, he behaved differently. He told her he was tired of superficial relationships. "I don't need another woman who wants something from me," he once told her. "I want someone who already has her own life." Elizabeth believed him. That was what made the betrayal so painful. At first, Richard was attentive. He called every morning, remembered details about her day, sent flowers, and celebrated her business victories. Then things slowly changed. His phone stayed face down. He began taking calls outside. He became protective of his briefcase. Elizabeth noticed, but refused to become someone who searched through a man's belongings. Then one night at exactly 1:17 in the morning, Elizabeth woke up and realized Richard wasn't beside her. She found him downstairs, speaking on the phone in the dark. "I told you, she can't find out." A pause. "No, not yet." Then came the sentence that changed everything. "She cannot find out about the second account." Elizabeth quietly returned upstairs. When Richard came back, he kissed her shoulder. She pretended to be asleep. The next morning, she noticed something on the hallway table. A black leather phone case. Richard had forgotten his second phone. It vibrated. One message appeared. "I can't keep waiting for you." Elizabeth photographed the screen, returned the phone, and said nothing. Over the following week, she watched. The second phone disappeared whenever Richard left. He carried it into the bathroom. He slept with it beside his pillow. And then Elizabeth noticed another detail. Richard had started coming home smelling of perfume she didn't wear. One evening he arrived almost 2 hours late. "Long day?" Elizabeth asked. "Very." "Where were you?" "At the hotel." "Which one?" He hesitated. "The downtown property." Elizabeth smiled. "I thought you were at the riverfront." Richard recovered quickly. "I stopped there first." He kissed her forehead. "I love you." Those words no longer comforted her. They frightened her. Because Elizabeth was beginning to understand that lies could sound convincing when wrapped in something true. 2 days later, she traced the unknown number. It belonged to Vanessa Reed, 38 years old, sophisticated, beautiful, and employed at one of Richard's hotels. Elizabeth searched deeper. For 18 months, Richard had been paying Vanessa's rent, buying her expensive gifts, booking private dinners, and transferring money into an account she controlled. One payment stopped Elizabeth cold. Money was moving from one of Richard's companies directly to Vanessa. Elizabeth expected anger. Instead, she felt confusion. If Vanessa was simply Richard's mistress, why was Richard using company money to pay her? And why had he been doing it for 18 months? Elizabeth called her longtime friend Margaret. Did he cheat? Margaret asked. I don't know yet. Then what do you know? Elizabeth looked at the engagement ring Richard had given her 3 weeks earlier. I know my fiancé is hiding another woman. That night, Richard came home with flowers and started talking about the wedding. I want it to be perfect. Why? Because you're the woman I want beside me. Elizabeth smiled. Then his second phone vibrated upstairs. Richard disappeared into the bedroom. Elizabeth heard his voice. Why are you calling me? Then a woman's voice. You promised me. Richard immediately ended the call. Elizabeth didn't confront him. Instead, she decided to find out everything. 3 days later, an email arrived from an attorney she had never met. Miss Carter, I believe you should know what your fiancé has been doing with your name. An attachment followed. Elizabeth opened it, then stopped breathing. Her own name appeared across the top. Beneath it was a transaction she had never authorized. A transaction involving $2.4 million. And suddenly Elizabeth realized Vanessa wasn't Richard's biggest secret. The affair was only the first layer. Underneath, it was something far more dangerous. Elizabeth immediately sent the document to Daniel Brooks, the attorney who had handled several of her business matters. His response came quickly. Don't discuss this with Richard. What is this? Where did you get it? Someone sent it anonymously. Don't delete the email. Daniel explained that 7 years earlier Elizabeth had invested in a small hotel development outside Chicago. She believed she had sold her remaining interest. She hadn't. The original agreement contained a retained ownership clause. Elizabeth still owned part of the property through a holding company, and that property had become one of the most profitable assets in Richard's hotel portfolio. How much is my share worth? Daniel hesitated. Approximately $12 million. Elizabeth stared at the wall. 12 million. The man who kept telling her she didn't need his money apparently knew she owned an asset worth $12 million. Then she asked the question that mattered. What does this have to do with Vanessa? Daniel investigated. 3 days later, he called. The payments to Vanessa were recorded as consulting expenses. Consulting for what? Your hotel property. Elizabeth felt a chill. There are no legitimate consulting services I can find. Richard had apparently created the position to move money without attracting attention. But Daniel had found something worse. Richard had been trying to refinance the property. He needed approximately $20 million. And Elizabeth's signature was required before he could complete certain parts of the deal. The wedding suddenly looked different. Richard wasn't simply planning a marriage. He needed Elizabeth legally connected to him before the financing closed. Then Daniel found messages between Richard and Vanessa. Once Elizabeth signs, everything becomes easier. Another read. Don't worry. She trusts me completely. Then, after the wedding, I'll make sure you get what I promised. Vanessa had asked. And what about her? Richard answered. She won't know until it's done. Elizabeth finally understood. Richard wasn't preparing to leave her for Vanessa. He was preparing to use her. Elizabeth decided to meet Vanessa. That afternoon, she found her outside her apartment. Vanessa froze. You're Elizabeth. Yes. Did Richard send you? No. I know about you. Vanessa's face fell. I can explain. I don't want an explanation. I want the truth. Elizabeth asked one question. What did Richard promise you? Vanessa looked away. Everything. She explained that Richard had told her he loved her and claimed his relationship with Elizabeth was already finished. He said you stayed because of the money. Elizabeth stared at her. And you believed him? I had no reason not to. Richard had created 2 realities. In Elizabeth's world, he was planning a future. In Vanessa's world, he was waiting to leave his fiancée. And in Richard's world, both women were pieces of a plan. Elizabeth asked whether he had ever asked Vanessa to sign documents. Vanessa hesitated, then pulled a folded paper from her purse. It was an agreement promising Vanessa a luxury property after Richard's divorce. Elizabeth recognized the address. That property isn't his. Vanessa stared at her. What? It belongs to the same company connected to my investment. Vanessa's face changed. He said it would be ours. Elizabeth's voice remained calm. Richard has been lying to both of us. Vanessa began crying. Then Elizabeth asked, Do you have anything proving what he promised you? Vanessa pulled out her phone. There is one recording. She pressed play. Richard's voice filled the car. Once Elizabeth signs the papers, I won't have to worry about her anymore. Vanessa asked, And what happens to her? Richard answered, She'll be fine. She'll have enough money to live comfortably. And me? You'll have everything I promised. The recording ended. Elizabeth knew she finally had evidence. But Vanessa revealed something else. Her brother, Michael Reed, worked in Richard's accounting department. He had overheard Richard discussing the plan. Elizabeth asked Daniel to find him. Michael sent a message before Daniel could meet him. I know what Richard has been doing, but if I testify, he'll destroy me. Then another message arrived. There's something you need to know before the wedding. Michael provided a spreadsheet showing millions moving between Richard's companies. One transaction stood out. A payment made 4 days before Richard proposed to Elizabeth. The recipient wasn't Vanessa. It was a company owned by Richard's longtime business partner and older cousin, Thomas Whitmore. The payment was labeled Acquisition Reserve. Daniel traced the records. Richard was preparing a major acquisition. Elizabeth's assets were part of the financing strategy. She asked Daniel what would happen if she refused to sign. The deal could collapse. And if I sign, you could lose control of the property. Elizabeth looked at her engagement ring. Don't stop him. Daniel stared at her. Elizabeth, let him continue. Why? Elizabeth looked at the wedding invitation. Because I don't want to stop the wedding. She wanted Richard to believe he had won. 2 weeks before the wedding, Richard placed documents in front of her. These are just formalities. Should I sign now? No rush. Elizabeth picked up the pen, then put it down. I'll sign after the wedding. For a fraction of a second, Richard's smile disappeared. Of course. That night, Elizabeth returned to the original investment agreement. Then she noticed something she had never seen before. A handwritten note had been attached to the document. It contained one sentence. If Richard Whitmore ever comes back for this property, don't trust him. Elizabeth recognized the handwriting. It belonged to her older brother, David. The problem was that David had died 6 years earlier, and Elizabeth had met Richard only 4 years ago. So how had David known him? The wedding was now only days away. Elizabeth needed answers, and the person who could give them was already dead. Elizabeth searched through an old box of David's belongings. Inside were hotel investment documents, financial reports, meeting notes, old emails, and a photograph. She picked it up. David stood outside a hotel beside 3 men. One of them was Richard. Elizabeth's hands began shaking. She had believed Richard entered her life by coincidence. He hadn't. David had known him years earlier. At the bottom of the folder was a letter David had written shortly before his death. Elizabeth opened it. David explained that Richard had approached him about purchasing the family's interest in the hotel project. David refused. He believed Richard was trying to acquire the property for far less than it was worth. Then came the warning. If he ever approaches you, remember that he doesn't want the hotel. He wants control of everything attached to it. Elizabeth lowered the letter. Richard hadn't discovered her investment recently. He had known about it for years. She called Daniel. Richard knew my brother. Daniel investigated the old records. Richard had been part of the original investment group. Thomas had been involved too. The hotel project had nearly collapsed because of an ownership dispute. David had fought to protect Elizabeth's interest. After David's death, Richard quietly purchased several other interests. Then Daniel found a document from 4 years earlier. Richard had requested a review of all outstanding ownership stakes. Elizabeth's name was on the list. Richard had seen it. He knew she owned the property before their first date. Every romantic memory suddenly felt different. The first dinner, the flowers, the proposal, the promises. Had Richard fallen in love with her? Or had he recognized an opportunity? Elizabeth wasn't going to ask him. The wedding was 3 days away. Richard became more affectionate than ever. He brought her breakfast, talked about their future, gave a toast to her at a private dinner. To the woman who changed my life. Everyone applauded. Elizabeth smiled. But she now knew Richard had studied her finances before telling her he loved her. 2 days before the wedding, Vanessa called. You need to see me. Vanessa handed Elizabeth an envelope. Inside was another document from 7 years earlier. A letter from David addressed to Richard. Elizabeth read the first line. You will never get my sister's share. David accused Richard of pressuring him to sell the family interest. He warned Richard that Elizabeth would inherit the remaining stake. Then came the final warning. If you approach her, I will make sure she knows exactly who you are. Elizabeth looked at Vanessa. I didn't know any of this, Vanessa said. Elizabeth believed her. Then Vanessa's phone rang. It was Michael. Her expression changed. He had discovered a hidden recording device in Richard's office. It hadn't been installed by Richard. It had been placed there months earlier by Thomas. Michael had also learned that Thomas wanted to meet Elizabeth before the wedding. They met the following morning. Thomas arrived alone. I owe you an apology, he said. I knew Richard was using your investment. When? Years ago. Why didn't you tell me? Because I was afraid. Of Richard? Thomas nodded. Then he slid a folder across the table. Inside were bank records, offshore transfers, fake consulting agreements, payments to Vanessa, and the agreement Richard planned to have Elizabeth sign after the wedding. Elizabeth read it. The document would give Richard control over several assets connected to her investment. It also contained a clause allowing him to claim those assets if their marriage ended under certain circumstances. Elizabeth looked up. He planned this before proposing. Thomas nodded. Months before. Then Thomas revealed Richard's larger plan. He wasn't planning to divorce you immediately. What was he planning? He intended to create debts against the hotel property, force a financial crisis, then offer to rescue you. Elizabeth understood. Richard wanted her dependent on him. He didn't simply want her money. He wanted control. Elizabeth closed the folder. Does Richard know you're talking to me? Not yet. Good. She stood. The wedding is tomorrow. Thomas looked confused. Why would you still marry him? Elizabeth answered. Because I don't want to stop him privately. She wanted Richard to walk into the ballroom believing he had fooled everyone. That night, Elizabeth called Vanessa. Are you still coming tomorrow? Vanessa hesitated. If I come, Richard will hate me. He already lied to you. What do you want me to bring? The phone. The recording? Yes. And the documents. Vanessa took a breath. What are you going to do when you take the microphone? Elizabeth looked at the wedding dress hanging beside her. I'm going to give Richard exactly what he wanted. What? A wedding? She paused. Just not the ending he expected. The next morning, Richard believed he was about to become the most powerful man in the room. He had no idea Vanessa had agreed to expose him. He had no idea Thomas had turned against him. He had no idea Elizabeth knew the truth. And he certainly didn't know that the wedding would give Elizabeth something he had never considered. A room full of witnesses. But hours before the ceremony, Richard received a message. 5 words. She knows everything. Stop her. Richard stared at the screen, then looked toward the bridal suite. For the first time, the millionaire was genuinely afraid. Richard immediately called the number. No answer. He tried again. Nothing. Then his phone rang. Thomas. Where are you? Richard demanded. Thomas was silent. Thomas. Finally, his cousin spoke. You should leave. Richard froze. What did you say? You heard me. Don't do this. Thomas sighed. It's over, Richard. The call ended. Richard stared at his phone. He had spent years believing he controlled every room he entered. That morning, he wasn't sure who controlled the wedding. Inside the bridal suite, Elizabeth sat quietly while Margaret watched her. You don't have to do this. I know. You could walk away. I know. Then why stay? Elizabeth looked at herself in the mirror. Because today, I stopped wondering whether I imagined the warning signs. A knock came. Vanessa entered carrying the black folder. For a moment, the two women simply looked at each other. You came, Elizabeth said. I almost didn't. Why? Because part of me still loved him. Elizabeth understood. That part of you doesn't have to disappear today. Vanessa handed her the folder. Inside were Richard's messages, payment records, property agreement, and recording. Elizabeth closed it. Keep it. Vanessa looked confused. Why? When I ask for the truth, I want you to be the one who gives it. Hours later, the ceremony began. Richard stood at the altar. He looked calm again. Then Elizabeth appeared. She walked toward him in her wedding dress. Richard smiled. You look beautiful. So do you. The vows began. The rings were exchanged. Richard said, I do. Elizabeth said it too. They kissed. The guests applauded. Richard thought he had won. Then the reception began. Dinner was served. Champagne flowed. Richard moved around the ballroom, accepting congratulations. Then he looked toward the entrance and saw Vanessa. His face changed instantly. She entered carrying the black folder. Richard approached her. What are you doing here? You told me to come. I changed my mind. You don't get to change it now. Leave. No. People nearby began watching. Richard reached for her arm. Vanessa stepped away. Then she spoke loudly. You promised me this wedding would never happen. The room began to quiet. Richard looked toward Elizabeth. Don't listen to her. Vanessa laughed bitterly. You said that because you thought she knew nothing. Elizabeth stood. She walked toward the stage. Richard followed. Elizabeth, please. She picked up the microphone. The ballroom fell silent. Richard whispered, Don't. Elizabeth looked at him. Why? You're upset. No. She looked across the room. I'm not upset. Then she turned toward Vanessa. Tell them. Vanessa stepped forward. She told the guests about the apartment, the money, the gifts, the promises. Richard tried to interrupt. Then Vanessa played the recording. Richard's own voice filled the ballroom. Once Elizabeth signs the papers, I won't have to worry about her anymore. Nobody moved. The recording continued. She'll have enough money to live comfortably. The recording ended. Richard's face had gone pale. Elizabeth. She raised one hand. Don't. Then Elizabeth faced the guests. I discovered the affair before this wedding. Shock moved through the room. Richard stared at her. You knew? I knew about Vanessa. She looked toward Vanessa. I knew about the apartment. Then back at Richard. I knew about the payments. Richard's voice cracked. Then why did you marry me? Elizabeth gave him a faint smile. Because I wanted to know how far you would go. She opened the black folder. You thought this wedding was going to give you control over my assets. That isn't true. Daniel Brooks stepped forward. It is. He placed the legal documents on the table. Elizabeth continued. 7 years ago, I invested in a hotel property. Richard said nothing. That investment became one of the most valuable assets connected to your company. Still nothing. And you knew? Richard looked around the ballroom. Elizabeth continued. You knew before we met. The room became completely silent. You didn't fall in love with my life. She looked directly at him. You studied it. Richard's voice became desperate. I loved you. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. Maybe you did. She paused. But you loved what you thought I could give you too. Daniel revealed the final document. The agreement Richard had planned to have Elizabeth sign after the wedding. The merger. The refinancing. The transfer of control. Everything was there. Then Vanessa spoke. There is one more thing. Richard turned toward her. Vanessa, don't. Thomas recorded Richard discussing the entire plan. Richard's face collapsed. Elizabeth looked toward the entrance. Thomas stood there. He walked into the ballroom. Richard stared at him. You betrayed me. Thomas answered quietly. No, I stopped helping you. Thomas explained the truth. Richard's business empire was already in trouble. The acquisition wasn't really about expansion. Richard needed Elizabeth's assets to keep his company alive. Without her signature, the deal would collapse. The millionaire image had hidden a financial crisis. Elizabeth had been the piece he needed. Richard finally stopped pretending. I was going to fix everything. Elizabeth looked at him. When? He said nothing. Before you took my money? Silence. Before you destroyed our marriage? Nothing. Before you promised another woman a future using things that belonged to me? Richard lowered his eyes. Elizabeth removed her wedding ring. She placed it beside the microphone. I came here believing I was marrying the man I loved. Her voice trembled. But I discovered I was marrying a plan. She looked around the ballroom. I won't spend the rest of my life trying to prove that I'm worthy of honesty. Then she turned toward the exit. Richard followed. Elizabeth, please. She stopped. For a moment, everyone expected her to turn around. Instead, she said, you wanted a woman you could control. She looked back at him. You should have chosen someone who didn't know her own worth. Then she walked away. 6 months later, Elizabeth's company had expanded into 3 new markets. She kept her investment. The merger Richard desperately needed collapsed. Several investors left. His reputation suffered. Vanessa never returned to him. Thomas cooperated with the investigation. And Elizabeth never became consumed by revenge. She became something much more powerful. Free. One evening, an envelope arrived at her office. Richard had written to her. He apologized. He said he missed her. He said he had made the biggest mistake of his life. Elizabeth read the letter once, then folded it. She placed it inside a drawer and closed it. There was nothing left to say. Richard had spent years believing money gave him power over people. But money couldn't buy trust. It couldn't buy forgiveness. And it certainly couldn't control a woman who had finally discovered the truth. The wedding had begun as Richard's greatest performance. By the end of the night, it had become his greatest exposure. And Elizabeth? She walked into that ballroom as his bride. She walked out as herself. So now, ask yourself this. If you were Elizabeth, would you have taken the microphone? Would you have exposed everything in front of the people who came to celebrate your marriage? Or would you have quietly walked away and let Richard live with his secrets? Tell me what you would have done. And if stories about betrayal, marriage, secrets, powerful women, and unexpected twists are the kind of stories you never get tired of, subscribe to The Unfolding Vault. Because sometimes the person sitting quietly at the wedding already knows exactly how the story is going to end.